Okay, good morning everybody, or good afternoon, as the case may be, depending upon when you're watching this video. So again, this is Dr. Golding, and we're going to talk today about our first reading. Our first philosopher that we're going to study is, of course, the great ancient Greek philosopher, Plato. So, Plato lived roughly in the 5th century BC. Probably many of you have studied a little bit of Plato already in your intro class. Plato was a student of Socrates. Socrates was actually put to death by the city of Athens in 399 BC. We don't need to talk too much about that right now, but the important thing to know about Socrates for our purpose is that Socrates was very interested in exploring the question of what is virtue? What are the virtues? So I'm going to write that word down on the board. The word virtue is actually a Latin-based word, and so the Greek-based word for which we get the translation virtue is arete. Arete is the Greek word for virtue. Now, virtue means something like good character. Okay, so a virtue would be a good character trait as opposed to a vice, which would be a bad character trait. All right, you could probably, as a little experiment, if you want to, write down a list of what you think the virtues are. What are the virtues? What are the qualities or character traits that are good for a person to have? And what are the opposite of virtue would be vice. So a vice is a bad character trait. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, long before Socrates or Plato ever came upon the scene, they basically had what sometimes is called the 5 cardinal virtues, the 5 main virtues that the ancient Greeks believed in. So I'm going to give you a quick list of the 5 ancient Greek virtues that many traditional Greeks would have asserted, hey, these are the virtues. So you have wisdom. Wisdom is a virtue. We're not going to try to define what wisdom is right now, but wisdom is something good to have. Courage or bravery is a virtue. Temperance or self-control. Temperance, self-control. Then you have justice. Justice is a virtue. And the last Greek virtue traditionally is piety. So, I think I'll just write those down on the board in case that went by too quick for you. So we have wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, and piety. Piety is kind of like a religious virtue. A pious person would be someone who has a good relationship with the gods, worships the gods, celebrates the religious festivals, has proper respect for the gods. That would be piety. Now, each of these ancient Greek virtues would also have opposites. The opposites of these virtues would be vices. So I'm going to try to write the opposites over here just to make sure I'm in your camera frame here. So we have foolishness. The opposite of courage would be cowardice. Let's just say injustice. And the opposite of temperance, intemperance. The words aren't so important. And the opposite of piety is impiety. Okay, so these are the 5 classic Greek virtues that many Greeks believed in long before Socrates or Plato came upon the scene. Now, before I was saying that Socrates was very interested in trying to really understand what is virtue? Is there some way of pinning down or coming up with a definition of what virtue is? And in each of these cases, for each of these virtues, can we somehow try to define, give a definition of what the virtues are? And can we in some way prove or establish that we can find the correct or the true definition of these virtues? Now, another question that Socrates was very interested in, and we're going to see this as we get into the first reading, is what I called, I think when we were talking about the syllabus, I may have used this phrase, the motivational question. The motivational question is, why should a person do something? In this case, the motivational question is, why should a person behave virtuously? We somehow think that people are supposed to be virtuous, that these are good character traits. Why should a person, what is the motive that should lead a person to behave in a virtuous manner? Socrates was very interested in that question. Now, just a little bit more historical background for those of you who aren't so maybe familiar with Socrates and Plato. Remember again that Socrates was found guilty of certain crimes against the state. He was found to be guilty of not believing in the gods of the state and of corrupting the youth. He claimed that he was innocent of these charges, but he was executed in 399 BC, and his most famous, he had a lot of students or followers. He claimed he never taught anything, so he would deny that he actually had any students. But he certainly had some followers, people who really liked him and would follow him as he went around Athens having philosophical conversations about such topics. And Plato is, or was, his most famous student. And Plato then took it upon himself to start writing dialogues, okay? Plato wrote in dialogue form. All of Plato's works are in dialogue form. I mean, we also have some letters that Plato wrote, but Plato wrote in dialogue form. So it's basically kind of like reading in a way sort of a play where you have characters, and Plato generally drew his characters from real life. In all of Plato's works, the main character almost always is Socrates, okay? And Plato would depict Socrates having various conversations with different people. Now, in the selection that we're going to get into very quickly, you have a conversation that is going on between Glacuon, so let me erase this stuff here. We're going to come back to these virtues later on, but in the first reading, which is a selection from Plato's Republic. That's one of his major works, the Republic. You don't need to write that down right now. But in this reading, Socrates is having a conversation with a fellow named Glacuon. Okay, so it's Glacuon and Socrates having a conversation. And as it so happens, your first reading is really, it's more like a monologue, it's more like a speech that Glacuon is giving to Socrates. And we're going to see that Glacuon essentially makes a certain kind of argument for a certain claim about why people do what they do. And then this is going to get applied to the question of why should or why do people in particular behave justly, okay? So the main thing that you need to know here is, what is Glacuon's major claim in this section, and what argument does he give to try to support his claim? And I'm hinting to you, the claim has to do with why people do what they do, okay? So Glacuon's claim is going to be initiated by his talking about a certain myth. There's a famous story that was sort of like a Greek legend And in this legend, there was a man named Gyges. So, Gyges is, for all practical purposes, Gyges was not a real person. He's a mythical figure, okay? But Glacuon tells a story about this guy named Gyges, which then he uses to try to make a claim about why people do what they do, okay? So, what is the story of Gyges? Now, the story of Gyges is the following, roughly speaking. You can see it in the reading. Gyges was a shepherd. He was living out somewhere in, not anywhere near a city. He was like a nobody, so to speak. He was not a famous person, not a wealthy person. He was a plain shepherd. He was out in the hills somewhere. And what happened was Gyges was shepherding his sheep somewhere, and he discovered a grave site, okay? And he goes down into the grave site and investigates, and he sees that there's an old dead body in there, and he notices that on the finger of the dead body there is a ring. Okay, so we're going to call this the ring of Gyges. The ring, excuse me one moment. Do you have a glass in here or something? Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Just wanted to answer a question there. Let's get back to what we were talking about. The ring of Gyges. The ring of Gyges is, again, this ring that Gyges finds on the finger of this dead body in the grave. Now, the story goes on that Gyges took this ring and he stole it from the cemetery. He stole it from the grave. He put it on his finger. And later on sometime, he was playing around with it, and he turned it in a certain way, and magically what happened? He became invisible. Wow. So the ring is something that you can use to make you invisible. The story of Gyges continues. What did Gyges do? Well, now that he was able to become invisible at will, the story goes on that Gyges used this ring to somehow get into the king's palace. Okay, so evidently there's some kind of a king who is the king of this country where Gyges is living, and using the ring to make himself invisible, Gyges then gets into the king's palace. He manages to seduce the queen and then kill the king with her help. Crazy story. And then he takes over the kingdom. And the story basically goes on that he lived, so to speak, happily ever after. Okay, so the story of Gyges is this man who found this ring, and he became invisible using the ring at will, and because he became invisible, he was then able to do whatever he wanted, including seduce the queen, kill the king, and take over the rulership of the country. And that's the end of the story of Gyges. Okay, so I might refer to this throughout the semester periodically. The story of Gyges, the ring of Gyges. Okay, so this now becomes step one in Glacuon's argument. Remember, Glacuon is the guy giving the argument, and the story is the story of the ring of Gyges. So Glacuon's argument doesn't stop there. I would say what we're going to do is we're going to say that this is kind of step one. This is step one in Glacuon's argument. And then there's a step two, okay? And if you did the reading, you'll see that after having described the story of the ring, Glacuon then goes on to make a claim about human beings. Okay? What is that claim? Basically, anyone who had such a ring would do what, just make sure we're in the frame here, would do what Gyges did. Maybe I'll put an exclamation mark over there. Anyone who had such a ring would do what Gyges did. Okay? He's basically saying that, and this is something you have to kind of think about yourself. Ask yourself, if you had a ring that made you invisible, what would you do that you don't do now? Well, basically, Glacuon is claiming that if you had a ring like Gyges did, you would end up pretty much doing what Gyges did. Now, I think we have to take this claim with, of course, a little bit of a grain of salt, but what I mean by that is that if you had a ring, you're not going to seduce the queen and kill the king, right? But rather, because there is no king around to kill, let's say, right? You don't live in a kingdom. You live in democracy, so there's no king. But the point is that, as Glacuon says, and I'm paraphrasing from the text, that no man would be able, or no man would even want to restrain himself or herself in doing whatever they wanted to do, whatever they pleased. They would kill whoever they wanted to kill. They would take whatever they wanted to take. Basically what he's saying is, if you were invisible and you knew you were not going to get caught and there were no repercussions no consequences for your actions, then you would do whatever you pleased to do. So now we're going to come back and we can talk about some questions and criticisms about these claims. But the conclusion, and now we're getting to what I said before, was the claim that Gyges makes is, we're going to write it down over here, that people, human beings, people, behave or act justly. People are just, and we'll come back and talk about that word in a minute. People behave or act justly only for the sake of consequences. Okay? People behave or act justly only for the sake of consequences. In other words, another way of saying the same thing is that no one acts justly for its own sake. No one really wants to be just. They just act justly because they're afraid of getting caught, they're afraid of negative consequences. That's why they act justly. But no one really wants to be just for its own sake. Okay? So, again, I think you might want to write that down too. Again, another way of saying his main claim is no human being acts justly for its own sake. People act justly only for the sake of the consequences. Meaning, they don't really want to be just because they want to be just. They want to be just because they're afraid of getting caught. There's certain consequences of injustice. So again, to review the argument is, he starts off with a story. The story is a fictitious story. We really know there's no such thing as a magical ring that makes you invisible. At least, I don't think there is, right? The story is a fiction. It's a myth. It's a legend. Then, having described the story, Glacuon then goes on to say, well, anyone who had such a ring would indeed end up doing what Gyges did. And remember I said, he doesn't mean exactly what Gyges did, but what he means is that you would end up doing wrong, bad things that you know you can get away with because you have the power of invisibility. So what that shows then, this is Glaucon's argument, and by the way, I'm not saying I agree with the argument, okay? I'm not saying I, Josh Golding, agree with this argument. I'm just presenting Glaucon's argument, and then we can look at it and think about it and see whether we agree with it or not. But Glaucon's argument is that, based on the story of the ring, anyone who had such a ring would not behave justly as long as they could get away with it. So what does that show? That in fact, in the real world, where there is no such ring, the only reason people are really behaving justly is not because they want to be just for its own sake, but rather they want to avoid or escape certain negative consequences. Okay, now we can also talk about, we've talked about negative consequences like getting caught, getting punished, going to jail. There are other kinds of negative consequences, such as being embarrassed, or something like losing your friends, or you're not going to be able to, let's say, if people know that you're a thief, they're probably not going to want to lend you money because they're afraid that you're going to go off and not pay back your loan. So that would still count as a consequence, right? You're not being just because you really want to. You're being just, let's say, paying back a loan. Why do people pay back their loans? Well, according to Glaucon, people pay back their loans because they're afraid of the negative consequences of getting caught, or they want to have a good credit record so that later on, when they want to borrow more money, they'll be able to borrow. Okay, so that again would be a consequence. Okay, and there can also be certain positive consequences of behaving justly. Let's say, so for example, you want to have a good reputation, or you want people to think of you highly, so you act nicely or justly. Okay, now one thing we can say here about justice, or people acting justly, is that it seems pretty clear that what Glaucon has in mind by justice would include things like not stealing, not cheating, and not murdering. Okay, so whatever justice is, we haven't defined justice here, but there's some kind of a background assumption that justice has to do with things like not stealing, not cheating, not killing innocent people. All right, and so again, what is Glaucon's major claim? People behave or act justly only for the sake of its consequences. Nobody really wants to be just for its own sake. So let's talk. What I'd like to do eventually, when we have our interactive discussion sections, is we might talk a little bit about what do you think about this argument? Do you think this is a good argument? Do you think it's a bad argument? Do you see any flaws in this argument? The general question really is what makes people behave justly. But I just want to say, someone might say, I have a criticism of this argument. Criticism is, I want to see what you think about this. The ring of Gyges is we've already said, it's a fictitious story. It's a phony. There never was such a ring. There never will be such a ring. I don't think, okay? So, maybe one day there will be the power of becoming invisible. A lot of science fiction stories revolve around magical rings that make you invisible. But could somebody say like this, the flaw in this argument is that there is no such thing as a ring that makes you invisible. It's a false premise. Here we have an argument, and the first premise is based on something false. Would that be a good criticism of this argument? So you can think about that, but I'd like to introduce a term, and by the way, whenever I introduce terms, those are always important to know, because they may pop up on, if there's an exam, but really you're not going to have any exams in this class because you're going to have papers. But anyway, terms are important to know, and you might want to use them in your paper if that becomes relevant. So here's a term that philosophers sometimes use to talk about this kind of argument, and that is a thought experiment. Okay, I hope you can see that up there. A thought experiment. A thought experiment is an experiment that you can't really perform in real time because you don't actually have the materials to perform the experiment. So a thought experiment is an experiment that you kind of do in your head. You imagine, what would it be like if I had a ring that made me invisible? What would other people do if they had such a ring? And then, based on your sort of estimation of how people would act under that circumstance, you then come up with some kind of a claim, in this case about why humans behave justly. So, I think what Glacuon would say to the criticism, remember the criticism was, hey, this is false, there is no such ring, your argument is bad because it's based on a false premise. Basically, Glacuon would say that's not really a good objection because I'm proposing a thought experiment. Imagine what you would do if you could get away with anything you wanted. Isn't it the case that you would end up doing whatever you wanted? So, I think then we have to look more closely. Anyway, I hope you understand the concept of a thought experiment. Again, a thought experiment is an experiment. It's a hypothetical situation that you consider to yourself and ask yourself, what do I think people would do if this situation were to occur? And then based on your answer to that question, you then propose some kind of a claim about the real world. In this case, about why human beings behave justly. So another thing to consider is number 2, of course, okay? Is this really true? Anyone who had such a ring would do what Gyges did. And again, we said already that we're not talking about exactly what Gyges did, but you have to think to yourself about what would you do if you had a ring that made you invisible. Would that change your behavior? Would you start doing things that are unjust? That's what Glacuon is claiming, is that you would start doing things that are unjust. Maybe you would start with small things, like, a little bit of let's say, shoplifting or pilfering or getting away with small things, and then eventually you'd be doing bigger and bigger things, and eventually you'd be doing things like stealing lots of money and maybe even murdering people that you don't like. Okay? Now, it might so happen that there's no one around that you actually don't like that bad enough that you would want to have a motive to kill them. So, Glacuon isn't saying that because you have this ring, you then become like a serial killer or a murderer. He's just saying that once you have this ring, you'd be able to do whatever you want and get away with it. And so therefore that shows that in the real world, when you don't have a ring, the only reason you're acting justly is because of negative consequences, and no one wants to be just for its own sake. So basically, that's the end of Glacuon's argument. Now, to be honest, if you really look at the Republic, the whole Republic, and see this argument in its proper context, and I think that the editor of your book explains this pretty well too, that Glacuon, in some way, he's laying down what we might call a devil's advocate challenge, okay? Devil's advocate, a devil's advocate challenge. By that I mean that he really doesn't want to believe that this is true. He wants Socrates. This is essentially, Glacuon is giving Socrates a challenge. He's laying down a challenge. He's saying, I want to believe that people should want to be just for its own sake. But it seems to me that it's just not true. So Socrates is being challenged by Glacuon to come up with some kind of a theory for why people should want to be just for its own sake. Okay, and that's what we're going to see not today, but maybe next time, or perhaps even the time after next. I'm not sure. But we will get eventually to Socrates' own answer to the question, why should people want to be just for its own sake? Okay, we're going to get to that, but not today. This is a challenge that Glaucon is laying down to Socrates to try to show me that I'm wrong, show me that people really do or should want to be just for its own sake and not merely for the sake of its consequences. Okay, now I'd like to introduce a couple of, again, terms. Terms are very important in this class. And some of the terms that I'm going to introduce, I'm going to erase the board just for the sake of space. But there is a modern term which I'd like you to be aware of. And it seems relevant to this conversation, to this argument. And we're going to talk about this term, which is really the name of a view that Glaucon seems to be professing, asserting. And it's called psychological egoism. Okay, now, the word egoism, you know probably, I'm sure you've heard of people talk about egoism has to do with selfishness. To be an egoist is to be a selfish person, self-concerned, me, that's an egoist. Okay, sometimes people talk about an egotist, which is someone who has a very high opinion of himself. And that's really something different. So there's egotism. Oh boy, we're getting a little complicated here maybe. Okay, so egotism with a T. An egotist is someone who thinks very highly of themselves. Whereas an egoist is, they may not think so highly of themselves. They might be kind of really humble, but all they really care about is themselves. Okay? So egoism has to do, and you probably know this, but I'll say it anyway, that the root of this word is the Latin word ego, which means I. Okay? I, or the self. So from ego, I, we get egoism, which is a kind of selfishness. Egotism is having a high opinion of oneself, kind of an arrogance. All right, but let's talk about this term, or this phrase, psychological egoism, okay? Psychological egoism is a view that many people have, and it seems like Glaucon has this view too. And you might wonder about whether you agree with it or not. But psychological egoism is the following. I'm going to write the definition down on the board, or at least the way I would define psychological egoism. And then we can talk about a little bit whether we think it's true or false, and how it plays a role in Glaucon's argument. Basically, psychological egoism says as follows. I hope you guys can see this, and if you're having any difficulty seeing the video or seeing the words, or if I'm moving around too much, please let me know so that I can try to adjust this presentation so it goes more smoothly for you as we continue throughout the semester. All right, psychological egoism says as follows. Every voluntary action and I'll underline the word we can come back and talk about what that means. Every voluntary action that a person, we're talking about human beings here, every voluntary action that a person does, comma, is done for the sake of the self-interest. Now that's really a loaded word, but let's carry on. is done for the sake of the self-interest of that person doing that action. Okay, I hope you can see that every voluntary action that a person does is done for the sake of the self-interest of that person doing that action. To say it in a more simple way, psychological egoism says that human beings by nature are selfish. Okay, I'll write that on the board here. Human beings by nature are selfish, or slash, we'll say self-interested. Okay? Everything you do for yourself. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the parts of this sentence over here. First of all, I say every voluntary action. Okay, so you probably know this, but I'll say it anyway. A voluntary action is an action that you choose to do, not something that you are compelled to do or forced to do. Because those actions that you're forced to do or compelled to do by somebody else or by some mechanism that's making you do something, they're not really things that you choose to do, right? Okay, so there may be certain things, like for example, the psychological egoist, someone who believes in psychological egoism, would agree that, if somebody hypnotizes you or drugs you and then gets you to do something like jump off a cliff or do something that's not in your self-interest, that can happen, okay? So we're saying if you're choosing to do it, you're going to choose to do it because there's some kind of benefit that accrues to you. Okay? Now, this is not saying, that's number one, clarifying the term voluntary. I hope that was clear. This is not saying that you can't ever do something that also benefits somebody else. Okay? The psychological egoist does not deny that a lot of actions that we do give benefit to some other people. Okay, so like for example, if you're a doctor, okay, suppose you're a doctor and you are curing people, you're helping people overcome their sickness. So you're doing things for other people. But according to the psychological egoist, the only true motivation that you really have for doing that is because it benefits you in some way. Okay? Now, there's very subtle ways in which you might gain benefit from helping somebody else. Now, the most obvious way, perhaps, would be if you're a doctor and you get paid for your services. So, sure, a psychological egoist would say that doctors cure people. They do things that are also in the interests of others. We're not saying is done only for the sake of the self-interest and never for the sake of any self-interest of another person. But what this means is that if you're doing something and you're doing it voluntarily, it may be helping somebody else, and you might know that, but you're only doing it in the end because it benefits you in some way, either monetarily, or it gives you some kind of sense of satisfaction, or joy, or pleasure, perhaps. Okay, so that is important to know about psychological egoism. Why is it called psychological egoism? Basically, the reason is because this is a view about human psychology. It's a view about human nature. It's a view about human motivation. What we're saying here, if we believe in psychological egoism, is that by nature we are, so to speak, hardwired. It's just part of our biology. According to the psychological egoist, this is not a choice that we make or don't make. Okay? Well, if we choose an action, then we're hardwired to choose only actions that are going to be in our own self-interest. That is the view known as psychological egoism. Now, it seems I think, you can think about this, but it seems like Glacuon believes in psychological egoism, right? He's thinking that people are going to do things only for their own interest or benefit. And so when we behave justly or we do the right thing, we're really only doing it because we're going to get something out of it, some kind of benefit to us. So it does seem that Glacuon believes in psychological egoism. And we're going to have to see whether Plato himself or Socrates agrees with this or not. Right now, all we know is that Glacuon seems to believe in psychological egoism. Now, another term that we should use here, the opposite in a way of psychological egoism, is we can talk about something called altruism. Okay, now the word altruism, I hope you can see that. The word altruism comes from the Latin word alter, which means the other. Okay, so altruistic behavior is, so to speak, other-directed behavior. If you're behaving as an altruist, that means that you are doing things for other people, not for yourself. Okay? So, basically, someone who believes in psychological egoism denies the possibility of altruism. Okay? Altruism, you might say, we could define altruism as the word altruism can be used to describe the way people behave, or it can also be used to describe a view. Altruism is the view that human beings are capable of genuine self-sacrifice. Human beings are capable of doing things that are not in their self-interest. It's not why they're doing the action. They don't even maybe care about their own self-interest. They're genuinely doing the action for the sake of someone else's interest. Okay? So, there is a debate, and this debate really continues to this very day. Whether genuine altruistic behavior is possible or not. So, psychological egoism says there's no such thing as genuine altruistic behavior. If you're doing something, there's some benefit or self-interest you're trying to get out of it. The altruistic view is no, human beings are capable of genuine other-directed behavior or actions that are going to benefit others and not necessarily themselves. Okay, I think, I would just make one observation. I don't want to tell you what you should think about this. This is something to consider and explore, but this debate about whether altruistic behavior is genuinely possible is really a very important one if we're going to try to figure out what is the basis of ethical or moral motivation. Those people who think that psychological egoism is true are always going to have to say that the reason why we do just or good actions has to involve some kind of self-interest. And those people who are altruistic are going to have a different view. The question for them is going to be, okay, well, if it's not in your self-interest, then why are you doing it? Okay, what could it be about the good, or what could it be about virtue or doing the right thing that is going to give you a motivation for doing something if it's not in your own self-interest? So that's going to be a good question. Okay, now a couple of other things. I think what would be helpful is to bring in something that Plato or Socrates talk about that's not in this particular reading, but it is relevant. And this has to do with the fact that Socrates says there's three kinds of goods, okay? There's three kinds of goods that we can talk about. All right, I'm going to erase this. We haven't settled the question. We haven't determined who's right or wrong here. We're just beginning our discussion about these concepts. I'm going to erase this. And we're going to talk about three types of goods Now, when we're using the word, when we talk about the word a good is something that you pursue, or something that you're going after, something that you want is a good, at least a good in someone's eyes. Okay, so Socrates, now sometimes I want to warn you, I switch sometimes from saying Socrates to Plato, Plato, Socrates. Remember again that Plato is the author of these works that we're studying right now. Plato is the author of these texts. And his hero is Socrates. So the character in the reading that really represents what Plato believes is always going to be Socrates. So sometimes I'll say Socrates held this, and sometimes I'll say Plato, who's using Socrates to express views that he agrees with. All right, so sometimes I'll split from Socrates to Plato. For our purposes, you could really view Socrates and Plato as kind of like one thing or one person. Okay? Anyway, Plato's the author, Socrates is the character that for the most part represents Plato's own views. He says that we can classify goods into three general categories. There are certain things that are good only for their consequences. And not for their own sake. Now he gives examples of each one. That's why I wanted to bring this out, because this will help us maybe get a better grip on what we're talking about with this good for its own sake, good for its consequences. Something that is good only for its consequence, or something that is pursued only for its consequences and not for its own sake, might be something like, let's say, let's suppose you have to have an amputation of a limb, because if you don't amputate the limb, then the disease in that limb is going to spread to the rest of your body, and then you're going to die. Okay? So, sad situation, but let's just think about that for a minute. If you say, okay, I need to have my limb amputated, you're not amputating the limb for its own sake. You don't want to just amputate the limb just to amputate the limb. In that case, you'd be doing something, and the amputation would be good, something you would desire, right? But it would be only because you want to avoid death. So you're not amputating the limb because you want to amputate the limb. You're amputating the limb because you want to avoid death. So that would be an example of something that is good only for its consequence and not for its own sake. Okay, another example, I don't know, I was just thinking, maybe, we go to the dentist. Suppose you go to the dentist for your checkup, or you go to the dentist to have your teeth cleaned. So, some people might actually like going to the dentist, and they enjoy being in the dentist chair and having their teeth cleaned. But probably a lot of people would go to the dentist only because they want to avoid a long-term problem of having unhealthy teeth. So they're not going to the dentist for its own sake, they're going to the dentist for the sake of its consequences. Okay, so you can probably think of many examples where you're not really doing it because you want to do it. You're doing it because of something down the road that if you don't do that thing, something else is going to happen and you want to avoid that. Okay? That's something that's good only for its consequence and not for its own sake. Okay? Then you have, interestingly, here's an interesting example of number 2. Category number 2 is something that is good only for its own sake and not for its consequences. Okay, something that's good just for its own sake and not for its consequences. That would mean you're doing it because you want to do it, but it's not going to have any good consequences or desirable consequences for you afterward. The example that Plato gives, and again, this is not in your reading, but I'm giving you some supplemental information here about what is in the Republic, which I believe is helpful and important for understanding what's going on. The example that Socrates gives of something that's good only for its own sake and not for its consequences is the smell of a rose. Okay? You might want to jot that down. The smell of a rose, or the smell of a pretty flower. All right? You're walking down the forest lane, and there's a beautiful flower there, and you sniff and smell that flower. It's something you wanted to do. It was good. It was something desirable. But you smell the rose, and then once it's over, it's over. It doesn't have any positive, good consequences for the rest of your day. Let's suppose. I'm actually wondering about that, because it seems to me that if I smell a pretty flower, that could have some good consequences that could carry over to the rest of the day. But anyway, Plato says the smell of a beautiful flower is something that it doesn't really have any positive consequences afterward. It's something that you want to do, it's good for you to do, you enjoy it, but then it's over and it doesn't have any good consequences. Okay, maybe you can think of some other, basically he seems to be saying something that's good for its own sake and not for its consequences would be simple pleasures that don't really have any positive, long-lasting effect. The third category, the best kind of good, so I'm going to try to make a check mark over here. The third category of a good would be a good that is both for its own sake and its consequences. Okay, something that is both pursued for its own sake and for its consequences would be the best kind of good. Now, the example that Plato gives of category 3 is actually health. And he's thinking here, well, let's just say, consider physical health, okay? Health is something that is good. We want to be healthy. We like being healthy. Health is something that we want because we want to be healthy. But in addition to that, health is something that we want for its consequences. What I mean by that, what Plato means by that, is that if we're healthy, we can then go and do things that we enjoy. Okay, so for example, if you're not healthy and you're stuck at home and you're in bed, you can't, let's say, go out and have a good time. You can't go out to restaurants, you can't go out to take maybe even a walk in the park. Because you're sick, you're sort of bedridden and you're at home. So ill health is bad for its own sake. You don't want to be unhealthy. And furthermore, ill health is bad for its consequences. And conversely, good health, having health, is something that's good both for its own sake and for its consequences as well. So that would be the best kind of good. And I'm just going to sort of tip you off here that eventually what Plato's going to argue, what Socrates is going to argue, is that virtue is really a kind of health of the soul. That virtue is a condition of the soul in which the soul, so we have to talk about the nature of the soul, and we're not going to get to this today, but Socrates thinks that virtue has to do with a condition of health in the soul. And once we understand that that's what justice and virtue really are, we're all going to want to be just for its own sake and for its consequences. But that's getting a little bit ahead of what we are on target to do for today. So, we got through the first couple of pages. Again, we had the argument that Glacuon gave to try to establish that people are only just because of the consequences. Nobody really wants to be just for its own sake. When we get to our interactive conversation, I'd like to hear more about what you think about that argument. Think about these questions, okay? Do you think that people are by nature selfish? Do you think that the only reason people behave justly or do anything that they do is for the sake of self-interest? And when we get to our conversation, we'll talk about some of those issues and hopefully hear your feedback on those questions. So we've gone on for about an hour today, and so I'm going to draw this lecture to a close, and next time we will continue with the next few pages of the selection from Plato. Again, we're still in chapter 2 for next time. Have a good day. See you next time.